The G7 leaders are meeting for the first time since August 2019. And in their efforts to prepare for this discussion about how they can work in concert to improve the economic resiliency of their economies in the wake of the pandemic, they asked independent panelists to prepare a group of recommendations that they could consider. I want you to take a look at them. But the thing that was the most audacious of all of the whole thing was what they self-titled this group of recommendations to be, the Cornwall Consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, that is a throwdown. That's like bye-bye Washington Consensus. What was the Washington Consensus? Well, back in 1980, it didn't self-dub itself the Washington Consensus. That came later, but it was the U.S. Treasury, IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank deciding that the path to success was more economic growth, and the recipe for economic growth was less government, more market. How do you get more market? More free trade. And in domestic economies, you need more deregulation, more privatization, and lower taxes. Okay, so that's the recipe for growth that has been pushed on the world since 1980. And the Cornwall Consensus has a bunch of different ideas. You probably heard about the 15% corporate minimum tax idea that got floated earlier this week that comes out of this consensus. But also there's an eighth bucket of recommendations that all focus on improving labor protections, improving labor inclusivity, actually giving a nod to the role of unions, mentioning that the countries, all 7 of these countries are signatories to the International Labor Organization's basic standards for labor protections, that they should be enforced. I mean, it's wild. It's the opposite direction of the Washington Consensus. Will the leaders bite? Stay tuned. I can't wait to see where we go with this.